But until tonight, I had hoped for an apology one day. I let out a mental sigh. I wasn't sure where my feelings stood after everything that had happened. I hated to say it, but I did miss them. Family was family. You only get one set of parents or siblings, and even though I might not like them, there was still a part of my heart that cared for them, even my difficult brother. But my father started to take away even the little good feelings I had left. I felt Amy looking at me as I stared out the window while Darren sped onto the highway for the main part of our drive to Noosa. "Are you okay?" Amy asked softly when the silence stretched on. "I think so," I answered, still lost in my thoughts. "It's been a tough evening. Fights and family stuff are confusing my mind right now." Tony turned to me from the front seat. "Robbie," she said, "you have done nothing wrong. Georgia and your family used your kindness and hard work. They expected you to always want the best for them, and when things went wrong, they couldn't admit it." Tony glanced at Amy for a moment. "Georgia knows she has lost you. She kept watching you and your father argue earlier." Tony smiled. "And she looked at Amy a few times, her face falling because she realizes you will never look at her the same way again. Until tonight, your family pretended that things could go back to how they were. I bet if she thought there was even a chance you would forgive her, she would leave your brother in an instant." I scoffed at that. "See," Tony responded, "Georgia knows she lost you, but it annoys her even more that she lost you to her younger sister." Amy laughed. "Well, I lost my older sister to Robbie's older brother. I'd say it's a fair trade, but I think I came out better." That made us all laugh. I joked that I got the better deal, and for the next 20 minutes, we exchanged friendly banter. I felt Amy rest her head on my arm as we traveled. When her arm wrapped around mine, she squeezed me gently before letting out a happy sigh. At that moment, I realized I loved Amy so much more than I ever loved Georgia. Why? Her actions. Amy didn't hold back when she stood up to my father for me tonight. I felt like she would have done anything if she could have. Sure, as Tony noted, Georgia stared at me because of what she lost. But she never stood up to my family or apologized during everything that happened. The car grew quiet as we continued down the highway. I fell asleep, tired, as we headed home. Home. For the first time tonight, I started thinking of Amy's place as home. I hadn't felt at home in over a year. Amy's place was beautiful. Who wouldn't want to call a house overlooking the Pacific Ocean home? But as I drifted off, with the street lights from the highway flashing over my eyes, I realized that home is more than just walls and a roof. It's about who you share it with. At Darren and Tony's, I was just a guest. Even though I lived there, it didn't feel like my place. Over the last few months, Amy had allowed me to arrange parts of the house to suit my taste. We talked about our ideas, and she shared what she envisioned, and then we worked together to make the changes. A couple of hours later, we arrived home. I'd been dozing lightly and woke up as the car stopped. Amy greeted me with a gentle kiss. I don't remember much about getting inside. But the next morning, I woke up with her resting beside me, her warm presence a comforting start to the day. As I got up, I tried not to wake Amy and headed for a hot shower. The water was soothing after the long night, and as it hit my tired muscles, I let out a small groan, feeling the tension ease. Suddenly, a cramp seized my right calf, making me wince. Before I could brace myself, Amy appeared and wrapped her arms around me. "Are you okay?" she asked, her face showing concern. "Just a cramp," I replied, managing a small smile. She helped me sit down carefully in the shower, and as I described where the pain was, she took my leg and began massaging the sore muscle. Her hands worked with just the right pressure, easing the knot in my calf. As she focused on the massage, her touch was calming, and I appreciated her kindness and care. Amy looked up at me, noticing my relief. She gave me a warm smile and a light-hearted comment. "Feeling better now?" I nodded gratefully. We stayed close, the shower's warmth surrounding us. Amy rested her head on my shoulder, and we shared a quiet, tender moment, comforted by each other's presence. As the water continued to flow, I felt grateful for her love and the small, caring gestures that made every day feel a little brighter. With a soft smile, she whispered, "I love you, Robbie." And in that peaceful moment, with only the sound of water around us, I felt a deep appreciation for the life we were building together, one gentle, loving moment at a time. When I finished, she sighed happily and looked into my eyes with warmth. "Feeling better, sweetheart?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, a bit distracted, caught up in her gaze and the calm feeling after a good moment together. She kissed me once more before helping me up. We then helped clean each other and shared some gentle moments. "I love you, Amy Brown," I said just before we stepped out of the shower. She pressed her wet body close to me. "I know, Robbie. You're mine now, and I'm never letting you go," Amy said with a firm smile. After we dried off and went downstairs, we saw Darren and Tony dressed and ready to head out for breakfast and coffee. "For someone who had a tough night, you look pretty relaxed this morning," Darren said with a teasing grin. Yeah," I replied, feeling a bit shy as they all laughed. We put on our shoes and hats and walked down to the village. We ended up at one of our favorite cafes called The Village. It was just right for a Sunday morning, with outdoor seating and wonderful coffee. Enjoying bacon and eggs was exactly what I needed after a long night. Since I wasn't in training mode anymore, I ordered a big breakfast with all the sides, just like Darren. It included toast, bacon, eggs, mushrooms, grilled tomatoes, hash browns, beans, spinach, sausage, and an amazing potato rosti. The girls chose omelets, and I was surprised when the owner, Michael, came over to personally serve us. He placed our meals down and reached out to shake my hand. "Great match last night, Mr. Other. Marie and I cheered for you all the way. I loved that final move when you took down Cody," he said, smiling. "Thanks, Michael, it was a tough match. Cody made it challenging," I replied. We chatted for a bit, and I promised to stop by for a photo in my gear soon so he could hang it on his wall. After he returned to the kitchen, I looked around the table. With Amy proudly holding my hand beside me and Darren and Tony across from us, I noticed how lovely the morning was. We could hear the ocean waves in the background. As we took it all in together, I felt a sense of peace and happiness I hadn't felt in a long time. With the morning unfolding and Michael's words still fresh in my mind, I asked the group, "Has anyone heard how Cody is doing?" So much had happened last night that I forgot to check on my opponent. In the ring, things were never personal. Even when there's some playful teasing, the winner usually checks in with the loser a few days later to show support. Darren chuckled a bit. "I heard from the event managers about an hour ago while you were in the shower. Cody just woke up this morning and doesn't remember the last round of the fight. He has a terrible headache, like he's had a long night out, and his arms and body are bruised so badly that they might delay his next match for another 6 weeks so he can heal." Darren looked at me seriously. "They said that Cody's opponent, Aaron Masters, doesn't want to fight him anymore. He's aiming for you." "He wants to fight me?" I asked. Aaron had traveled around the world last year and won more fights than he lost. He was favored to win against Cody, while I was seen as less likely to win against Cody. Darren nodded. If you're thinking about it, I wouldn't rush. You'd need to follow a specific training plan. But I shook my head. No, as much as I'm curious, last night was great, but it was really close. I don't want to put myself at risk that soon again, I replied, sipping my coffee and pondering how last night could affect my fighting future. We kept chatting. Darren reviewed my moves and defense with a video he took on his phone. The girls listened. At one point, Tony turned to Amy and asked, "So how did you enjoy the fight last night?" Darren's girlfriend asked mine, her face showing she was expecting a fun reply. "Which one? The one in the ring or outside?" she said with a smile. We all laughed at that. "The one in the ring," Tony said after the laughter faded. "They were both great for my man, but the one in the ring was something else," my girlfriend replied, looking at me with admiration. "I saw Robbie get ready, and I'm really glad the two of you were there to support him. The way Robbie handled himself, he took those punches and kept going at him. Even if he hadn't won, I would still be proud of him." She smiled widely. I grinned back and gave her a kiss. "I've also received a dozen messages from my Alro team who were there. They all loved it. Robbie is going to be very popular with them," Amy told us, her hand resting on mine as she spoke. Tony nodded thoughtfully. "You know Georgia would never attend his fights?" "Yeah, I know. She always complained about it whenever we talked. But I guess she finally saw how impressive my man is last night," Amy said with another smile, squeezing my arm. We spent another half hour discussing my moves, how I kicked, how I coped with Cody's punches, and how I executed that final move. "So, Robbie," Darren said, signaling a change of subject, "what do you think about the other fight? Do you know what you will do about your family?" I thought for a moment, remembering some talks Amy and I had about it recently. I shrugged. "I don't know. My dad sounded serious. I guess he is coming for me. If he thinks I will just give in without a fight, he is wrong. I will stand up to them if that is how they want it." "We will," Amy replied firmly. "Sorry?" I asked her. "We will stand up to them," she repeated, stressing that it meant both of us. "Robbie, I won't let you handle this alone. You are important to me, and if they want to come after you, they are coming after me too. They threatened you last night, and they also threatened me. I even have a recording of it," she smiled. I could see she was ready for the challenge. We spent the rest of our time discussing different plans. Then we walked back home. The four of us changed clothes, grabbed towels, and headed to the beach. For the next few hours, we swam and relaxed on the beach. Darren and I enjoyed catching waves while the girls played and soaked up the sun. I hadn't mentioned Tony before. She is a few years older than me, but stays fit by working out with Darren often. She has a slim figure that makes heads turn when she walks by. Whenever someone looks, you can hear Darren laugh and Tony smile. Though they are not married, Darren and Tony have been together for over 15 years, since high school. Sometimes, Tony worries about not being able to have kids, but they have been happy together, and it hasn't caused any problems. I was always proud that Darren stayed by Tony's side, showing his support for her. Today, in her pale yellow swimsuit, Tony displayed her confidence. Amy, on the other hand, has curves that catch attention from many guys on the beach. Indeed, a few guys tried talking to her. Amy just laughed and pointed to me, saying I was her boyfriend. When one guy didn't take no for an answer, Amy asked if he had seen the fight last night. He said no, but had seen the highlights online. Amy pointed to me again, telling him to see who her boyfriend was. I have never seen someone leave so fast. After a few days of relaxing and enjoying their company, Darren and Tony went home. The following week, it was time. On the morning of the final divorce hearing, Amy and I woke up, got ready, and while she made some work calls, I called George. He confirmed our afternoon meeting and said he would be there. We chatted for a little while longer, and when we hung up, I let out a deep sigh. "Are you okay?" Amy asked as she stepped out onto the balcony. It was starting to become one of my favorite places to think. She was on hold for a conference call with a colleague from Europe and one of her suppliers. "Yeah, it looks like it will be an interesting afternoon," I said. Amy laughed. "Yes, it certainly will." The call began, and Amy winked at me. She got on the call for about 15 minutes while we finished getting ready to drive down the coast. This time, unlike our trip up from the Gold Coast, we were taking Amy's car. And it was quite the car. Worth almost $200,000, she had an imported, customized 2021 Shelby Mustang. It was a bright white color and had blue racing stripes running down the middle, along with a sleek rear spoiler. The black Shelby Cobra logo on the front added to its charm. The first time I saw it, I was amazed. "Amy, what is this?" I had asked. She smiled widely. "It's our car," she replied cheerfully. She let me take the wheel for the drive. Wow. When I pressed the gas, the car responded like no other vehicle I had been in before. With over 900 horsepower, I felt a little nervous at first until I got the hang of it. Highway driving became incredibly fun. As we entered the courthouse for the final divorce hearing, I couldn't help but grin after that exciting drive, even with everything going on. We met George, who shook our hands and smiled when I mentioned my drive in Eleanor. The name Amy had given her car. Yes, Gone in 60 Seconds influenced that name, but it fit such a stunning vehicle. George, Amy, and I walked into the courtroom when it was time. A few minutes later, Georgia arrived with my parents, Brad Jr., and 2 lawyers from my father's firm. My father smirked at me and began talking to the lawyers while pointing in my direction. They pointed back at George, who smiled nicely. When they exchanged worried glances and whispered to my father, his smile faded a bit. The proceedings went as expected. The magistrate read through the divorce petition and the financial arrangements before granting the divorce. Georgia glanced at me a few times, and I looked back at her. She also frequently looked over at Amy with a frown, but Amy just smiled kindly in return. The judge officially granted the divorce, mentioning how sad it was to see another marriage end because of dishonesty. He called out Georgia for being unfaithful. She turned a bit red, but the process needed to move forward. When he brought the gavel down, it was over. As we left the court, George, Amy, and I chatted when one of my father's lawyers approached us. "I'm sorry, Mr. Other," he said to me. "I tried to change their minds, but they wouldn't listen." He looked worried as he glanced at George. I nodded and extended my hand. "Mr. Robbie Other, you've been served." He handed me a big envelope and tried to step away casually. I passed the envelope to George, who smiled. "We had thought my family might attempt something like this." "Thank you, Randy. I will ensure this gets the right attention," George said politely to my father's lawyer. Randy turned pale. "You mean you're going to? Never mind." He shook his head and walked back to my father, who had lost his smile again as Randy explained who George was. George was well known across Australia as one of the country's most respected lawyers. He had rejected the offer to become Queen's Counsel 5 times to focus on his successful law firm. He supported Amy's business in its early days based on a recommendation. When George met Amy and saw her potential, he invested in her and has been by her side since. Now, as her lawyer, he was also mine. Don't tell anyone, but George was a genuinely good person. But when he looked at Randy and my father with a smile, It felt more like a predator eyeing its weak prey. "You kids go ahead. I'll handle this now," George said as he opened the envelope and looked through the papers. He raised an eyebrow and then turned back to Randy, who lowered his head in defeat. Outside the courthouse, Amy and I walked to her car. Just before we reached it, I heard her call my name. "Robbie, wait!" my mother exclaimed, walking towards us. My father followed her slowly. "We need to stop meeting like this," I joked, facing them. In the distance, I saw Brad Jr. and Georgia getting into his Lexus. Georgia gave me a sad look before they drove away. "What do you want?" I asked my mother and her husband. I was finding it hard to think of him as my father anymore. "Robbie," Mum began, her voice pleading, "I talked to your father, and he's willing to drop the lawsuit if you agree to talk with us." I raised an eyebrow at her, ignoring my father. I was realizing that my mother was struggling, and her attempts to keep peace were weighing her down. "Is that all?" I asked. "And you need to apologize to us, and then return to work at Total Build for half pay over the next 3 years. "Oh, yes. And you won't be receiving any extra money to pay us back what you owe," my father said, placing his hands on my mother's shoulders. I could see she felt uncomfortable as she shifted in her seat. I laughed and said, "Goodbye, Brad Hattie. I've given your ridiculous lawsuit to my lawyer, just so you know. We all made ourselves clear last time. You started a conflict, Brad. And now you've taken it further by serving me papers. I don't see us as a family anymore, and we won't ever be on friendly terms again. I won't apologize to you, and I doubt you feel sorry for being unfair either." I turned to face them fully, crossing my arms as I watched my father's anger rise. I grinned and continued. "You want to fight, Brad? You've got it, dear father. Now, unless you have anything else to say, my girlfriend and I have plans. See you in court." I smiled, took Amy's hand, and walked to her car. If I had looked back, I might have seen my mother trying to escape my father's grip while he frowned. His expression soured even more when we didn't walk around the fancy car, but instead got inside, started it, and drove away, leaving marks on the road behind us. The next 3 months were some of the best times of my life. I stayed away from my family as Amy kept her promise to take me on an adventure overseas. With Alro, we traveled in style business class flights, fancy hotels, private cars, and great meals in several countries. Every few days, Amy would meet with various people. Sometimes it was her team, but most often it was with companies that Alro was hoping to invest in. I got to sit in on a few of those meetings as a guest, and was surprised to see that my girlfriend was not easily intimidated. The night before meetings, she would review documents and send emails to gather information, getting ready to speak confidently with people much older than her. In one meeting, we met Mr. Craig Eli, the new CEO of one of the companies. His resume boasted 30 years of experience. When we all sat down at the big table and introduced ourselves, this man started showing his arrogance, making it clear he didn't like a young woman being in a position of authority. After he made a couple of rude comments about Amy's ideas, I was very upset. Amy hadn't said anything wrong, but everyone else in the room looked uneasy. Amy was not embarrassed. She was focused and ready. After the third interruption in just a few minutes, where he pointed out that Amy didn't understand their business, she quickly changed the topic. She asked about how they recognized revenue on the balance sheet, which made the older man sneer. Before he could respond with anger, which seemed likely, Amy raised her hand to stop everyone. Calmly, she turned to the chairman and the CFO, who both looked uneasy. They knew very well that Alro had made a significant investment in their company, and that Amy led Alro. When Amy stood, I got up with her, as did the local manager, Margaret. "I'm sorry, everyone," Amy started, looking at the chairman and the CFO. "But this meeting is over. I came to learn about the future of Alro's investment. Instead, your chosen leader has treated me poorly. Before I came here, I heard 3 complaints from Margaret about Mr. Craig Ellis' behavior, and now I understand why there have been so many complaints. That's nice. Craig Eli cleared his throat and replied arrogantly. But I have 30 years of experience. I know how to run a company. Oh, Mr. Eli, Amy said, pretending to be impressed. 30 years of experience sounds great. Let's take a look at your record, shall we? She paused. This was not the same cheerful woman who had supported me. This was a strong CEO firmly challenging what she saw. Still standing and facing Craig Eli, Amy opened a folder in front of her. Out of the 5 companies you have worked with in the last 10 years, 3 of them ended your time there quietly. Another one didn't renew your contract, and I'm sure if we looked more closely, we would see similar results everywhere. You focus more on quick successes rather than lasting growth, and the team spirit is usually very low when you leave. I admired Amy's confidence and how she spoke. Craig Eli started to stutter. Amy continued to apply pressure. You're on your 4th marriage. Your last 2 ended because of your unfaithfulness. Your current wife knows about your actions and may take serious steps soon. Craig Eli turned pale when she mentioned his wife. The room fell silent, waiting for what Amy would say next. Mr. Eli, I may not have 30 years of experience like you, but I have a fantastic team worldwide that ensures I have all the information I need. Alro invests a lot of money each year in many different businesses worldwide. As the founder and CEO of Alro, it is my job to speak up when I see something wrong. She held out her hand and Margaret placed some papers in it. I have paperwork saying that Alro will stop supporting this company in 5 days, unless Mr. Eli is removed from his role as CEO. Alro sees Mr. Eli's continued employment as a bad investment and will take action accordingly. She turned to the rest of the room. I want to make it clear that I don't believe Mr. Eli is a good leader. There will be an emergency board meeting at 6 this evening to vote on this matter. Margaret will attend as usual in Alro's board seat, and I believe you know how she will vote. With that, Amy closed the folder and walked out of the room with Margaret and me following closely. We were quiet in the elevator on the way down. Amy was all business until our private car arrived to take us to lunch. After saying goodbye to Margaret, Amy took a deep breath and ran her hands through her dark hair once we were back in the car. How did I do? She asked, glancing at me nervously. You were amazing, I said, really impressed with her. You handled that situation so well. Amy stared out the window at the scenery, but took my hand. I knew we would have to let him go, but I wanted to give him a chance. Many people doubt me because I am young and a woman, but I have to be smart and recognize problems quickly, or I wouldn't be leading Alro today. You did really well. I want to always be there for you, I said, sharing my feelings. Amy smiled, looking pleased. You care about me? She asked, her focus shifting from work. I smiled back as we were driven along. Of course, I said, kissing her again. Then let's head back to the hotel. I need some time with you, Amy said playfully. We spent the afternoon relaxing at the hotel pool and enjoying our time together in our room. Later that evening, Amy heard that Craig Eli had been let go, and we made our way to our plane for our next destination the following day. We spent 2 weeks in the United States. Half the time was for work and the other half was for sightseeing. But once we landed in Europe, our business slowed down. Amy shared she wanted a vacation, and since I was with her, it was a great chance to visit the places we talked about on our first date. We traveled around, enjoying everything we could in Germany, Italy, London, Ireland, and France. We shared special moments in many places, including a beach where people were not fully dressed. I felt a twinge of jealousy when some men admired Amy's figure. She mentioned feeling concerned about women noticing me as well. We tried this as an item on our bucket list, and while it was enjoyable, we both knew it was a one-time experience, since we cherished our relationship with each other. While having tea in London, we received a message from George about Total Build's ongoing lawsuit against me. He informed us that the first court meeting did not go well for them. The meeting's outcome was not favorable for Total Build. The judge questioned my parents about their decision to sue their own son. My father's attorney argued that I had broken the work agreement, leading to a drop in the company's profits and quality. George responded that I'd resigned and reached out to Fair Work Australia to receive my rightful benefits and bonuses. My father, unexpectedly bringing personal matters into the courtroom, shared that I recently got divorced and was not in touch with the family. When the judge asked why, my father continued to explain, despite his lawyer's advice, that I had left Total Build because I needed to move on after discovering my brother, who managed sales, with my ex-wife. George found it amusing when he quoted my father saying, "He needs to get his head straight. Just because his brother has a baby with his ex-wife doesn't mean he can leave the business." This caught the judge's interest. Further discussions revealed that my family had hidden things from me until I caught my brother in a situation that changed everything. The judge suggested my parents reconsider the lawsuit, explaining it would likely fail and they could face consequences for unfairly suing their son. A court date is set for 6 months from now. In Ireland, we enjoyed Guinness a lot. We spent much of our time in pubs or relaxing together. When we reached France, the romantic side of both of us flourished. We visited the Louvre, saw Notre Dame, shopped on the Champs-Élysées, took photos while kissing under the Arc de Triomphe, and got engaged at the Eiffel Tower. Yes, we got engaged. In one of those romantic moments when we landed in Paris, Amy had to attend a meeting alone. I assured her I would explore the area and find a cafe to wait for her. I did just that, and she met me with a smile. I ordered a glass of wine and some cheese for us to share while I waited. Before she arrived, I found a local jeweler and bought a simple engagement ring, featuring a small diamond set on a plain gold band. It was a small amount, just enough that it wouldn't hurt my budget. That night, we had dinner at the Eiffel Tower. After finishing the main course, we stepped out onto the balcony to enjoy the views of Paris when I knelt down on one knee. "Amy," I said, pulling the ring box from my coat pocket, "the last few months have been wonderful. I never knew someone could give so much without thinking of themselves. If it weren't for you, I might still be angry and lost, just going through the motions. But when you came into my life, you helped me in ways I never expected. Every morning since then, I've hoped to wake up and find you beside me. The joy I feel when I see you is proof that if this is a dream, it's the happiest dream I've ever had, and I never want to wake up." I opened the ring box and held it out. Amy was smiling brightly, almost like the lights shining above us. "Amy Brown, I want to share my life with you every day. Will you marry me?" Amy blushed and smiled, her eyes shining with joy. "Yes," she exclaimed, while people around us cheered and clapped. I slipped the ring onto her finger as she beamed with happiness. The next day, we took our time together at home, enjoying each other's company. Amy was excited to show off her engagement ring, proudly letting everyone know she was engaged to me. But all good times must end, and with a bit of sadness, we boarded the plane back home to Australia. I had to admit, it felt good to be home. Amy didn't have any travel plans for the next few months since we had spent so much time together during our trip. A couple of days after we returned, I brought up the idea of finding a job. Living with Amy had made my savings dwindle faster than I expected. Now that I was going to be married, I wanted to regain some pride by working again. When I mentioned it to Amy, a smile spread across her face. "Honey," she said, her eyes sparkling, "having you with me these past few months has been amazing. You were my support during the few meetings you attended, and even when you weren't there, I felt like I could always count on you." But Amy paused. I raised an eyebrow, curious about what she would say next. "You're right about needing a job, and I know you're skilled in construction and management. What if you started your own construction company?" she suggested, a playful glint in her eye. I could tell she had a clever idea in mind. I smiled, thinking it over. Starting a business would indeed be a new adventure for me. "You're right, babe," I responded, still considering the possibilities. "You're right. I know about construction, but if you're thinking I should take on Total Build, I really don't have the funds to compete with them. I've always worked in operations, not with the crews on the ground," I replied. "That's not true, Robbie. You're engaged to the CEO of Alro," my fiancé said with a smile. "I'm sure we can find a way to raise some funds." "Alro Homes?" I asked, and Amy laughed at the name. "If that's what you want, my dear," Amy replied. In the following month, I created a business plan, an operational guide, a financial plan, and a hiring strategy. I collaborated with Amy on the details. We started in Queensland and aimed to expand to other areas as our business grew. I was excited to return to the construction field, but this time it was different from my experience with Total Build and the family business. Together, Amy and I discovered that while small homes were popular, there was a great opportunity in building homes from shipping containers. We would use these containers to create homes. We planned to launch with 3 models: a small unit with a bathroom, kitchenette, and a combined bedroom and living area, a modest model made from 4 containers that could be arranged in various ways, and a larger 2-story model made from 10 containers. All of them were modular and ready for placement at the client's chosen site. The containers could be covered with various materials and were well insulated. Thanks to Amy's connections, we already had 4 major clients interested before we even launched, including a big caravan park chain. With Alro supporting us, I found we had access to clients that had previously been out of reach for us at Total Build. It took nearly 4 months to prepare everything. One day when Amy found me working at her kitchen table, she cleared a spot for me in her office, saying she wanted me closer. I made sure to present the complete business plan to the Alro board. I didn't want to rely solely on my relationship with Amy. Sure, she helped me get in the door, but I wanted everyone to believe in our potential for success. With the financial support from Alro, we leased a mid-sized factory space. I hired 3 teams, a couple of administrators, 2 account managers, a marketing expert, and we were ready to go. During our free time, Amy and I began planning our wedding. Amy dreamed of a beach wedding at sunset. I liked the idea and suggested we do it near her parents' home. As we discussed the details, we realized it would help keep many guests from violating the Alro privacy agreement due to location. Amy thought it was a great idea. Amy's parents, Rain and Peter, supported us as we moved forward. At first, our family was happy for Amy and me, but they had some doubts about our relationship. However, once we returned from our trip abroad, they quickly became excited about our upcoming wedding. We shared some pictures of our time together and a video of my proposal at the Eiffel Tower, and that seemed to win them over. I felt like part of the family again. Through Rain, we learned that Brad and Georgia had tied the knot, and she was expecting their second child. As Rain shared this news, I noticed she seemed a bit sad, almost reluctant to tell us. "Is she sure it's really Brad's baby?" Amy asked, sounding a little critical. Peter and I exchanged glances and quietly chuckled. I knew Peter cared deeply for Ruth, his older stepdaughter, but he had always struggled to get along with Georgia. Now, he took steps to steer clear of her. Rain glanced at Amy and then looked away. "Amy," her mother replied softly, "that's a more important question than you might realize." I nearly spilled my drink in surprise. "What?" I said, shocked. "I'm sorry, Robbie," Rain said, giving me a sympathetic look. "Things in your old family are not good. It seems after you left Total Build, many of your clients followed your lead. The company is having a tough time, and when some clients learned why you left." For a moment, we all sat silent as we processed this news. "Oh," I said, my eyes widening. "Oh." It all started to make sense. I left, and my brother and ex-wife were now involved. Amy studied my face, trying to read my feelings. I smiled at her, and when she saw my expression, she smiled back. "Well, it couldn't happen to nicer people," I said, trying to keep it light. I was aware that Georgia was still Rain's daughter and had given her a grandchild, but I couldn't resist a small jab. Rain sighed and gave me a sad smile. Along with Amy and Tony, Rain was one of the few who really understood my situation. At first, she struggled to understand Georgia's actions, and without the grandchild, I wasn't sure if she would still be talking to her. "In the past 6 months, Rain began, nervously, it also came to light that Georgia and your brother got involved with a group of people who, well, let's just say they socialize in a way that's complicated." She blushed as she spoke about her daughter. I looked at Peter and he nodded, showing he felt the same way, also a bit embarrassed. Amy burst out laughing, not caring about their discomfort. "So my sister made a questionable choice in marriage, got involved with some wild side activities, and now she's pregnant, possibly by someone else? Amy, I know you have your feelings about her, but Georgia is still your sister," Rain told her firmly before letting out a resigned sigh. "Georgia thinks it might be Brad's, but she admitted it could be one of 3 different guys," Rain said softly. I stayed quiet and took a sip of my drink, a mix of rum and cola. Peter always made sure there was a bottle ready for me. For a moment, I looked at Rain, my former mother-in-law. I realized, not for the first time, that she would soon be part of my life again. When I married Georgia, it felt like I had gained a second mother. But when I learned some surprising news about her, Georgia got too shy to talk to me for several weeks. My family knew everything, but the Brown family had no idea. Once she got over the shock, I found someone to share my feelings with, instead of my own mother. "Why are you telling us this, Rain?" I asked my soon-to-be mother-in-law again. She shrugged and sank back into her chair, looking sad. "Because it's just that." Rain buried her face and cried. But then, another voice joined us. "Because you are a good man, Robbie, and my sister hurt you. On top of that, your family treated you terribly through it all." Ruth, Amy's older half-sister, stood in the doorway with a pizza and a bottle of wine. "You might not want to hear it, but Mom feels you should know how things have changed." Ruth came in and set the pizza in front of us. Peter quickly stood up to get a glass for Ruth, and he returned with both the rum and cola for the others, too. Rain looked at each of us, and then, with tears in her eyes, she nodded at Ruth's words. "Before we go any further," Ruth said, smiling at Amy and me, "can I have a hug from my favorite brother-in-law and my soon-to-be favorite sister?" Feeling grateful for the light moment, we both stood up and hugged Ruth. She admired Amy's engagement ring and asked to hear about how the proposal happened while we ate. Ruth was tall and slim, like Georgia, with nearly platinum blonde hair. She had 2 children with her husband, Dave Masters. They got married while still in college after dating all through high school. Dave and Ruth were very loyal to one another, but they often argued. I remembered a time at a family gathering before Georgia and I were married. I watched as they yelled at each other, each storming off in different directions. Later, they returned, apologized to each other and the family, and sat next to me. I asked them about it. Ruth shrugged and said marriage was complicated. But for her, there was no one else but Dave. They didn't have to agree on everything to be happy together. I looked at Dave, and his earlier frustration was gone, replaced by a warm look as he nodded in agreement. Coming back to the present, I shook my head. "What's the rest of the story?" I asked as we settled back down and started eating our pizza. Rain glanced at Ruth and nodded, happy not to be the one sharing the story. "I've heard bits and pieces from Mom and Georgia," Ruth started. "First, Robbie, I don't agree with what your family did. I think Georgia's choices were wrong, and I admire how calm you were about it." Ruth looked into her glass of wine, took a breath, then looked at me. "But Georgia is still my sister. Even though I'm disappointed with her, I still talk to her sometimes because she doesn't have many friends left." "I see," Ruth continued. "When I was almost 4, my dad left Mom. I don't remember much, but there's a feeling of sadness that sticks with me like a memory of pain. So when I saw my sister just disregard her marriage vows, it hurt." She took another sip of her wine. Rain appeared lost in thought, remembering something. "I've heard," Ruth said to everyone, "that Brad pressured Georgia to join him at parties for months. Usually you need to be a couple to get invited. So she said no at first. But when she found out you left with Amy, she was heartbroken and agreed to his demands. She told me it felt like all her hope was gone, and nothing mattered anymore." "Why?" I said, mostly to myself. "Georgia is the one who cheated on me and had another man's child." Ruth nodded. Rain looked somber, and Amy seemed a bit annoyed. "Georgia thought you would eventually forgive her and come back," Ruth said, with a shrug, taking another bite of pizza. "When she learned you went away with Amy, she fell apart. She went back to Brad, and now they're going to those parties together, and now she's pregnant." Ruth looked at me closely, as though there was more to the story. But now it was my turn to speak. I sighed and met Ruth's gaze. "I have to say, part of me feels satisfied to see how upset she is, given how things went for her. But I don't understand why I need to know all this. Georgia is in my past, and Amy is my future. I trust you won't put me in a position where I have to see Georgia again, so why do I need this information?" I looked over at Amy, sensing she had similar feelings. She hadn't spoken to Georgia at all and knew nothing of this. Ruth sighed again and looked to her mother for support. Rain gave her a gentle nod. "It's because one of the possible fathers might be your sister's fiancé," Rain said softly. I nearly choked on my drink. "What?" I exclaimed. Sorry." I glanced at Amy, who looked just as shocked. Both Rain and Ruth nodded. "Joanna's fiancé was with Georgia?" I asked, unable to believe it. Sorry for the words. Then a sad grin appeared on my face as I realized what this meant. "Is it Chris? The guy she was seeing before I stopped talking to him?" Chris worked as a contractor at Total Build. He made a move on Georgia years ago, but it didn't lead anywhere. Then he started dating Joanna, and their relationship had been on and off ever since. "Yeah," Ruth said, looking down at her glass of wine. "It was Chris who mentioned the idea to your brother first. Georgia told me that Chris had a crush on her when you two were together. When he found out you separated, he suggested to Brad that they could try something different, thinking he could be closer to Georgia. Now he might be a father. And how is my dear sister handling this? I asked, trying not to smile. Not well, Rain replied, taking over for Ruth now that it was about someone else. Joanna participated in the events, but when she learned that her fiancé could have gotten her sister-in-law pregnant, she exploded at Chris, Brad, and Georgia. Right now, everyone is hoping the baby is Brad's. Ruth took a sip of her wine, studying me. All right, Ruth, spill it, Amy said, looking at her sister. I know you have more to share. Ruth managed a sad smile. This part is a bit ironic, and Robbie, I think you'll find it interesting. When Georgia got the positive pregnancy test and realized it might not be Brad's, they went to your parents. It took me a moment to piece it together. No, I said, a grin spreading on my face. Yep, they did, Ruth confirmed. I burst out laughing. Amy looked at me as if I had lost my mind while I laughed hard. What? Amy asked, confused about this part of the story. I looked at Ruth, who was now smiling, then at Rain, who looked puzzled. Lastly, Peter was smiling too, showing he understood. I turned back to Amy. I said to my fiancé, my parents told Georgia and Brad to keep it a secret from Joanna. I looked back at Ruth. A moment later, Amy's eyes widened. No, they didn't? Yes, Ruth said. About 3 days after the pregnancy news, Chris started wondering about the timing, and then everything came out at a family gathering. Joanna was really upset, calling Georgia every name she could think of, and yelling at her parents for trying to keep things hidden from Chris and her. I couldn't help but chuckle a bit. Ruth raised her hands to quiet us all down. I only have Georgia's side of the story, she said. As her older sister, she has called me a few times when she needed to talk. She feels troubled and worried. Brad still wants them to go to those parties. And for the first time, Georgia feels confused and hurt. Can you believe that? I smirked. Funny how things feel different when the tables are turned. I took a breath. I'm sorry, Ruth, Rain, if I seem a little unsympathetic. They both nodded to show they understood. Changing the subject, I asked, what about my parents? I'm not sure, Ruth replied, leaning back on the couch. Georgia hasn't told me much, but they said it would all pass with time. They think Joanna will get over it since she was at the parties too. A sudden thought hit me. Wait, Joanna and Brad? Ruth chuckled. Georgia mentioned that once. They drew names and laughed before picking again. She said it worried her a little but didn't go into details. I shook my head. How did I not see that I was stuck in such a messy situation? Because you're a good person, Peter answered quickly. Rain, Ruth, and Amy all nodded. The rest of the evening, the 5 of us talked about what was going on with Georgia and my family. Then we shifted to happier topics, like my upcoming wedding to Amy and our world travels. We carefully avoided discussing Halro. By now, Amy's family was used to her keeping things private about her job. Later, after hugs, Ruth asked me to walk her to her car. I agreed, and once we reached her car, she turned, hugged me, and looked at me with that caring big sister attitude Joanna never showed. You seem happy again, Robbie, Ruth said with a smile. I shrugged and smiled back. I am, she laughed. Are you working again? I nodded, but she stopped me before I could explain. I'm guessing you're doing something with Amy, since you're not sharing any details? I thought for a moment. In a way, yes. But I'm doing something I enjoy. Good. You deserve to be happy after everything you've been through. But Robbie? I looked at Ruth. While I know what kind of man you are, I also know my youngest sister. She thinks the world of you. She always has. But if you ever—" I held up my hand to stop her. "I would never let myself hurt her," I finished for her. Ruth smiled at me. "I know, Robbie, and that's why I care about you. I just needed to say it. With Georgia, I never had much, but with Amy. I understand, Ruth. I really do. Amy means everything to me. I thought what Georgia and my family did would trouble me for a long time. But Amy—" I paused, taking a moment to think. "She saved me, Ruth," I said, feeling a tear form in my eye. "I've never told anyone except Amy," I continued, looking into the dark sky. "I was just pretending to be okay while living with Darren and Tony. I was often drinking or training, feeling very low. I even thought about giving up a few times." Ruth gasped in surprise. "But when Amy showed up with Joanna, everything changed," I explained. "From that day on, I never thought about hurting myself again. Now, all I want is to be with Amy. I could never harm her. She is my hero, Ruth. You say she looks up to me, but I feel the same way about her. I know she's nothing like Georgia." Ruth hugged me and wiped a tear from her eye, and then there was a brief distraction. Suddenly, I felt a familiar embrace and soft lips on my neck. It was Amy. I smiled. "Good night, you two," Ruth said with a grin as she got into her car. Amy moved to my side, resting her head on my shoulder. We waved goodbye as Ruth drove away. A couple of months later, I found myself in a familiar room on the morning of our wedding. I was back at Darren and Tony's house, while Amy was at her parents'. The day was bright with a few clouds, but it looked like it wouldn't rain. I woke up late, and Darren took me out for breakfast. We took our time until noon, then we showered and shaved. George joined us for a light lunch, and then we got dressed, ready for the photographer to take some pre-wedding pictures of us. Darren was my best man, and George was a groomsman. When the photographer arrived, Tony said goodbye, heading over to Rain and Peters to get ready as a bridesmaid alongside Ruth. We took photos and relaxed for another hour while watching some professional fights. This included Cody's latest match in the U.S., where he narrowly won against his opponent. Later, we headed down to the beach for the ceremony. I was amazed at what the event company had arranged. The small part of the beach we picked had been transformed. There was a raised pavilion for the ceremony, decorated with ivy and a variety of flowers from the Gold Coast that highlighted the natural beauty around us. Around 100 seats were set up on beach carpet, a special type of mat that allowed sand to pass through but was stable enough for women in heels to walk on. A lovely ocean blue carpet stretched from the parking area where Amy would arrive to the altar. In the background, the waves gently rolled onto the shore as the tide slowly moved out, reaching the low tide mark about an hour after sunset. For the first time, I felt a little anxious. Darren must have noticed. "Are you all right, Robbie?" he asked with a smile. "Just a few butterflies in my stomach," I answered, trying to smile back. As the guests started to arrive, I pushed aside my nerves and began to greet everyone. There was a mix of people. Our team from Alro and Alro Homes came, along with their partners, making about 60 people. This included Amy's staff from overseas who she had invited. I recognized a few faces from the Brown family's gathering at my wedding to Georgia. To my surprise, the mayor of the Gold Coast and a state government representative showed up, having been involved with Alro for a while. I had met the mayor several times through work, and he expressed his sympathy over my recent change, but had a happy look in his eyes regarding my marriage to Amy and the work we were doing together. "By the way, I've always been curious, what does Alro stand for?" the state representative asked me during our chat. I smiled. It had taken me a while to learn what it meant from Amy. We were almost a month into our travels before she finally told me. I leaned closer to the mayor and said in a low voice, "Amy loves Robbie Other." I leaned back, keeping my smile. For a moment, the politician just stared at me. "You can't be serious? You mean all this time?" His face showed a mix of surprise and amusement. I nodded. As more guests came to greet me, he took his wife's hand, shaking his head and laughing. About half an hour before sunset, a limousine arrived. I found myself holding my breath as Rain stepped out quickly, walking to her seat in front as the bride's mother. On her way past, she kissed my cheek and smiled widely at me. At that moment, I looked up and saw Amy standing at the top of the stairs, her father, Peter, holding her arm and smiling proudly as he prepared to give his only daughter away. Amy took my breath away. I think every groom feels a wave of emotion when they see their partner for the first time. With a bit of guilt, I thought back to my time with Georgia, remembering a similar feeling. But with Amy, we had shared both good and hard times, which deepened the moment for me. With Amy, I felt truly accepted for who I am, not just for what I could offer. Georgia was beautiful and loved me at the beginning, but we were more caught up in excitement than true love. I have to admit, given my family situation, I thought several times that we might not belong together. Now I feel that my marriage to Georgia was never based on trust or friendship. The music started, and Ruth and Tony walked ahead of Peter and my bride down the aisle. Amy looked stunning. Her simple white strapless dress flared out at the hips. Her bridal train trailed behind her. It covered her face, falling over her eyes and stopping at her nose. She wore deep red lipstick, and her eyes had a soft blue shadow that matched the carpet beneath her feet. The minister spoke, but I hardly heard his words. I was too nervous, just staring at her. We somehow managed to exchange our vows while looking deeply into each other's eyes. I was filled with excitement. My heart raced as I was about to marry my business partner, my hero, and most importantly, my best friend. The ceremony went on as we gazed at each other. In the background, we heard the minister ask if anyone had objections to our marriage, and to speak now or forever hold their peace. Usually there's a pause and a few smiles go around. Then everyone feels relieved, and the ceremony continues. But in our case, as Amy and I focused on each other, we didn't notice a group that had joined our guests midway through our vows. "I object," a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. Most of the people gathered were just passers-by, curious about a beach wedding. But among them was a group I wished would leave us alone. At the front of the group stood Amy's half-sister and my ex-wife, Georgia, who was expecting a baby. Georgia walked forward, followed by my parents and Brad Jr. If I looked farther back, I could see Joanna and her fiancé, Chris. The minister, a local pastor named Gordon, cleared his throat. "On what grounds do you object?" Gordon was a good guy. Amy and I had met him a few times before, and I could tell he hadn't encountered an objection at a wedding before, judging by his expression. Georgia turned to me, looking hurt. "Because it's wrong. He's my husband. He can't marry my sister." Amy and I exchanged glances, raising our eyebrows and smirking as whispers spread through the crowd. Amy nodded, giving me the go-ahead. "Georgia," I said, still holding Amy's hand, "we've been divorced for a year and separated for almost twice that." I knew my words would have an impact, so I let them sink in. "That doesn't matter, my love," Georgia replied, her voice sounding sad and desperate. "You're mine, and you always will be. I have spent a year watching you with someone else, but you need to come back to me," Georgia said. I noticed Brad tense up and my parents looked worried. Amy and I exchanged laughs. The audience began to whisper as they started to connect the dots. I looked at Amy again. She gave me a playful smile and a tiny nod. I decided that if they were ready for this, I might as well share my truth for some excitement. I took a deep breath. I stopped being yours the night I came home and found my older brother in my bed. The room went silent at that statement. I stopped being yours when I heard you both talking about me while I was away, planning to tell me that the child you're having was mine when you knew it wasn't. People started whispering urgently, and my family looked uneasy. I stopped being yours when I discovered my family hid your secret from me for 3 years. Anger surged within me, and Georgia took a step back. My family's faces showed their uncertainty. Whispers grew louder, but it was still quiet enough to hear a pin drop. I can't be yours because you married my brother after I divorced you for your dishonesty. More surprised looks filled the room. And let's not forget that the child you're carrying might belong to my sister's fiancé, not your current husband. The whispering stopped, and Georgia's face lost its color. No, Georgia, I continued. You and my family have no right to object to my marriage to a wonderful woman who helped me heal from the pain caused by all of you. None of you can say anything against me loving a woman who has given me her all and saved her heart for me. I turned to Amy for a moment, and she looked back at me with understanding. Then I looked back at Georgia, who was now in tears. My mother also had tears in her eyes while my father remained calm. My brother looked embarrassed. I briefly glanced at Rain. She was looking at Georgia with sadness, which seemed to be her usual reaction to my ex-wife. None of you can object to my marriage to Amy, and none of you were invited here today. The hurt you all caused affects us all, and while I hate to bring these family matters to light today, you need to understand that I want nothing to do with any of you, I declared, making myself clear. We stood there staring at them. Amy glanced back at George, who nodded and stepped away from his role as my groomsman. I had a feeling something like this might happen, so I asked George to be ready. Amy whispered to me. Brad Other, Hattie Other, Brad Other Jr., Georgia Other, Joanna Other, George said firmly. I have a restraining order that states you must stay away from Mr. Robert Other and Mrs. Amy Other for the next 2 years. If you break this order, you will be taken into custody. Amy signaled her mother, who stood and moved toward Georgia. They exchanged quiet words for a moment, and then George and Rain escorted the 4 of them away. I noticed that Joanna and Chris had already left. After about 15 minutes, we returned to the ceremony. During that time, Amy held my hands tightly. Gordon cleared his throat. Are there no more objections? He looked around and everyone laughed. He finished the ceremony, I lifted Amy's veil, and we shared a kiss as everyone, including those who had witnessed the earlier drama, cheered. Darren stood up, amusing everyone as he explained that we would be taking photos on the beach right away, and then we would return to greet everyone as Mr. and Mrs. Other. We spent about 30 minutes for the photos. The photographer was excellent, capturing beautiful shots. However, amidst our smiles and laughter at the shore, there were some sad images too. In the distance, my family appeared unhappy, and, over the years, Amy and I looked at that photo and felt a sense of loss. It was a difficult memory. Our honeymoon took us to Greece, where we had a great time exploring the sights and enjoying delicious meals. We made friends with locals during the day and enjoyed each other's company in the evenings. Once we returned home, we got back to work. Alro Homes was thriving, and many people sought our high-quality products. Surprisingly, farmers began requesting single-container homes to replace old quarters. After several requests, I asked our team to create an Outback line designed for the tough Australian outback, catering to the lifestyle of property workers. Once the word spread, We sold more of those units than any others in the first year. As CEO of Alro, Amy was always busy, but all it took was a glance for her to rearrange her schedule and spend time with me. After the first few months of our marriage, she would often come to interrupt me while I worked on various projects. Our first disagreement was about something we felt strongly about: a prenuptial agreement. George had prepared the document after I asked several times, but I found out that Amy had kept postponing it. We argued seriously over the document one evening, both of us saying things we regretted. In short, Amy didn't want a prenuptial agreement. I admired her for that, but I knew she needed legal protection for her company, Alro. She raised her voice at me. "Do you know what the company name means?" Amy's voice was full of emotion. "It means there won't be any agreement. What's mine is yours, and that's it," I responded, saying I understood that. But she still needed protection. The argument fell apart quickly. At one point, Amy hinted that now she saw how my family felt about me being so stubborn that I couldn't see reason. We both knew she didn't mean it when she said it, but it was out there. For a moment, we were both quiet. I looked at her, hurt by her words, even though I knew she didn't really mean them. A short while later, I left her in tears. For the next 2 hours, I shut myself in the gym, working out so hard that my knuckles were sore. I didn't tape them before hitting the punching bag, and I pushed myself until I became exhausted and fell asleep on the floor. When I woke up, I found my head resting in Amy's lap, her tears soaking my shirt. "Robbie? Oh, Robbie, I'm so sorry. Stay with me. An ambulance is on the way." She looked at me and saw that I was awake. "Robbie? Robbie?" She kept saying, I'm sorry, repeating it over and over. They took me to the hospital, checked me briefly, then let me go. I was in a very emotional state after working too hard on Alro Homes. I just needed a bit more rest. "I'll sign the agreement, baby," Amy said as we cuddled in bed later that evening. "I'm sorry for what I said. It was wrong, and I feel terrible." I kissed her head, feeling her warmth against me while she quietly cried. "It's all right, Amy. I know you didn't mean it," I told her. "I guess I'm not perfect in your eyes anymore. I feel not good enough," she said. "Shh. You're just as human as the rest of us. You were right, too. I know I can be stubborn sometimes. We just had our first real fight. That's all," I reassured my wife, holding her close. "You need to understand that the prenuptial agreement doesn't bother me, because what mine is yours and what's yours is mine for as long as we're together. I just want us to be safe if anyone ever asks about it. I married you, not your money." "I know, love," Amy replied as she nestled against me. "It just felt wrong to sign it." After we talked a bit more and shared comforting touches, I felt a warm connection with her. Soon we were close under the moonlight in our bedroom, appreciating the love we shared. Afterwards, we both felt better, finding calm after our first emotional argument. The next week, Amy had to take an unexpected 3-day trip to New Zealand. A studio wanted to film a new fantasy series in the beautiful New Zealand wilderness. Alro had a big investment in one of the production companies the studio was working with, so Amy was asked to go to some meetings to support the project. She found it harder to be away than I did that first night. She called me from her hotel in the evening, and we spent hours talking, just like when she was home. We even had some playful moments over video chat, which made us laugh. It was nice to see each other and share some fun. The next night, we didn't get a chance to talk, because she had dinner with the production team. But before I went to sleep, I sent her a text saying I loved her and would see her when she got home the next day. In the morning, I went to Alro Homes and spent most of the day with our teams, making sure we were on schedule. I had meetings and worked with the admin team on our finances. Everything was looking good, and we were on track to make more money this quarter than we'd expected. When I got home, I started to feel uneasy. Amy still wasn't home, even though she should have been back hours ago. I tried calling her, but only reached her voicemail. For the next hour, I kept calling different devices and apps. I even called Maria, the Alro manager in New Zealand. She hadn't seen Amy since the dinner with the clients last night. I could tell she sounded a little uneasy as I spoke to her for the third time without news of Amy. "Maria, what's happening? What aren't you telling me?" I asked her. "Nothing, Robbie. It's nothing," she replied, but it didn't sound convincing. I looked outside at the setting sun over the ocean, and my worry began to grow. Where could Amy be? "Maria, this isn't right. My wife is missing and you're not being straight with me. I need to know what's going on, or I will contact the police," I said, feeling desperate. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then I heard her sigh. "I'm not sure how to say this, but last night we all went out, the studio team, the production company, and a few others," Maria started. "Yes, I know. Amy mentioned it," I replied shortly. "Well, she had a few drinks and there was a guy named Kurt. He's a production manager and he spent a lot of time with Amy," she continued. I held my breath, trying not to let my mind race ahead. I began pacing in our living room. "Maria?" I said, looking for answers. "I really don't know, Robbie," Maria answered. I think she was trying to respond to my unasked question. Amy didn't seem like herself for most of the evening. When she got up to leave, Kurt followed her. I didn't see or hear from either of them after that. We both remained quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," Maria said gently. We talked for a bit longer. Maria mentioned she was checking with several people but hadn't heard anything new. She hadn't contacted the authorities yet, but she planned to do so if there was no news in the next few hours. I could sense her worry. Maria had been at our wedding a few months ago and knew how difficult this was for me after what happened with Amy's sister. After hanging up, I nearly collapsed on the couch by the balcony. I wanted to yell. I wanted to cry. I kept thinking of different reasons why Amy might not be speaking to me or why she and Kurt had left without a word for almost 24 hours. I called Peter and Rain, then Darren and Tony, to see if they had heard from Amy, but none of them had. I contacted the hotel, but they said Amy had checked out and couldn't share more information. I tried everything I could think of, but I still couldn't locate my wife. While I was on hold with the New Zealand police, I noticed car lights passing across the glass door, which meant someone was arriving. In a hurry, I rushed outside just as a very nervous Amy was getting out of the car with the driver's help. I quickly went to her side and held her close. The moment she felt my arms around her, she began to cry. The driver took Amy's bag from the trunk and gave me a sympathetic smile, which I acknowledged with a wave. As Amy held on to me tightly, she didn't say a word. I brought her inside and sat her on the couch, handing her a box of tissues. My wife cried, leaning against me but not looking at me. I noticed a fear in her that I didn't know how to help with. As I held her close, my heart ached. My love for Amy was much deeper than what I had felt before, yet in that moment I feared being hurt again. I wasn't sure if I could handle feeling that pain a second time. Still, I also realized that my love for her was as strong as ever. At that moment, I decided that even if things were tough, I would forgive her no matter what. If my heart needed to hurt to keep Amy safe and happy, I would take that chance. Emotion filled the space between us, and she held me tightly. I felt her trembling a little, but her grip remained firm, like she was afraid I would disappear if she let go. As the minutes passed, I took a deep breath. "Amy?" I asked softly, looking down at her. She lifted her gaze. Her face was tear-stained, and her usually smooth black hair was messy and stuck to her cheeks. Her tears had stained her cheeks, and her shirt was nearly soaked. Amy's eyes were red and puffy. "Robbie, She started to cry again. I let her cry for a few more minutes, then leaned forward and handed her some tissues. "Shh, it's okay here," I said gently. She glanced at me and then at the tissues. That was when I saw the scratches on her arm. They were red and starting to heal. As she wiped her eyes, she noticed my frown and followed my gaze. "Amy, what happened?" I asked softly. She didn't say anything for a while, but at least she had stopped crying again. "Robbie, I am so sorry," she said finally. "Sorry? Amy, are you okay?" My worry grew, but not because I felt betrayed. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. I wanted to hold her, but I felt scared. My heart raced, and I could hear it in my ears. What had happened? Was she still my wife? Had something bad happened? "Robbie, I don't want to lose you, but could you get me some water while I try to calm down?" Amy asked, showing many emotions I couldn't grasp yet. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, filled 2 glasses with water, and returned to the couch. "Thank you," she said quietly, trying to stay calm. She took a sip, looked at her arm, then back at me. "Robbie, this won't be easy." She spoke softly. "You might not like me after I tell you this, but I have never lied to you." I swallowed hard. Amy met my gaze for the first time since she came home. I watched her gather her strength. "Last night, Maria and I went to dinner and drinks with the production team after our meetings," she explained. I already knew this part, so I nodded. "Dinner was nice, but I missed you. While I was getting ready, I thought about calling you just to hear your voice. I was thinking about the fun we had the night before." She blushed a little. I stayed quiet, holding my breath, knowing she was getting to something serious. As we sat down for the meal, I started to feel a bit unwell. I had some wine. Amy raised a hand. I know it's not my usual, but everyone else was drinking, so I thought 2 glasses would be fine. She glanced at me before looking down at her hands. "One of the production managers, Kurt, was flirting with me all night. I didn't encourage it, but he kept trying. I think Maria noticed, but she wouldn't step in unless I asked for help." Amy continued, speaking softly. I finished my dinner and began to feel unusually tired. After finishing my glass of wine, I excused myself, explaining to the group that I wasn't feeling well and had an early flight in the morning. I said goodnight and made my way out of the dining area. A few moments later, I noticed Kurt was also leaving, saying his goodnights as he followed me. I didn't think much of it since we were all staying at the same hotel. But as we got in the elevator, I felt a wave of nausea. Kurt offered to help me back to my room without waiting for me to ask. Once I reached my room, I quickly unlocked the door and barely made it to the bathroom before feeling sick. As Amy told me this, I listened carefully, feeling uneasy as she continued. I sat there for a few minutes trying to recover when I realized that Kurt was still there, rubbing my back. At first it felt comforting, but then I remembered that this wasn't you, it was someone I didn't know well, in my hotel room. Trying not to look uncomfortable, I stood up, washed my hands, and walked back into the main room, politely thanking Kurt for helping me, and hinting that he should go. But he kept asking if I was okay and handed me a water bottle that had already been opened. Amy paused, visibly uncomfortable, but continued with a hint of reassurance in her eyes as she looked at me. I felt uneasy about the water, so I placed it on the table. I tried to signal that it was time for him to leave. She took a deep breath and explained how Kurt hadn't taken the hint. She eventually asked him directly to leave, telling him she needed rest. He turned as if to go, but instead kicked the door shut, changing his demeanor entirely. As I listened, Amy explained how Kurt suddenly acted aggressively, insisting she was his, and that she should comply. My stomach tightened with anger as Amy described how she resisted, doing everything she could to get him to stop. Kurt was physically strong, but Amy remembered the self-defense moves I had taught her. She used them, managing to push him back and injure his foot, then his leg, just enough to give herself a chance to escape. Amy ran for the door, calling for help as she undid the bolt. But just as she reached the handle, Kurt pulled her back, causing her to stumble, and hit her arm against the desk, where she got the scratches I'd seen earlier. Though hurt, Amy didn't give up. She fought back, refusing to surrender, and defended herself bravely. Her voice grew steadier as she finished her story, and I felt a sense of pride and relief that she had made it out safely, grateful for her resilience in such a difficult situation. Amy told me that when Kurt came toward her, he tried to tackle her, but she quickly rolled away. She stood up fast and kicked him, first in a sensitive spot and then in the head. Kurt was starting to feel the pain. Just as she was about to kick him again, the door burst open. 3 big security guards rushed in after hearing the commotion just as Amy kicked Kurt again. In the chaos, the security team had to hold Amy back. Kurt, now unconscious from her last kick, was taken to the hospital, and Amy was arrested. She was kept in custody for hours without proper help, making her anxious. Since she was from Australia, they wouldn't let her call George or me because it was an international call. Her phone was broken during the struggle, so she didn't have Mariah's number either. The police didn't care who she was, they just saw her as someone who attacked a man. Once Amy finally got a public defender early the next morning, she spent a long time trying to explain to the inexperienced lawyer that she was just defending herself. However, it wasn't until almost mid-morning that they began to believe her story. Kurt, who had woken up at the hospital, claimed that Amy had been flirtatious with him during dinner and invited him to her hotel room. When he turned her down, he said she became violent. While the police didn't fully believe him, he questioned how a smaller woman could fight someone as big as him without catching him off guard. The police were stuck with these 2 different stories, one from a man in the hospital and another from Amy, whom they thought might be in the wrong. Things changed when Amy got sick again. They had given her some water and a snack, and not long after she became ill. A doctor was called to check on her. He took some blood and interviewed her again, and it started to appear that she might have been drugged. This time, when she shared her story, they listened more carefully. The police went back to her room and found her in the bathroom. They saw the water bottle and some blood on the desk beside her. She laughed when they asked how she could fight back against someone like Kurt. "My husband is Robbie Other, the MMA fighter who took down Cody McGuinness." One of the officers recognized the name from that fight. Once it became clear that Amy was the victim, things started to work out for her. Soon enough, her public defender made sure that Amy was released and taken straight to the airport. No one could reach me because the person trying to call had dialed one number wrong. Panicked and alone, Amy chartered a plane to go home but promised to come back for the trial. Just before she boarded, the police handed her a report. Kurt was arrested for a serious attack along with several charges related to drugs and intentions that weren't good. The test results they showed Amy indicated that she hadn't taken any drugs. However, she would have been in big trouble if she had drunk any of that water mixed with the harmful chemicals Kurt had put in it. "So why were you so sick, Amy? If he didn't drug you, could it have been bad food?" I asked. "That's the surprising part, sweetheart. It wasn't drugs or bad food when the test results came back. She told me, still sniffling from telling me the story. They said I could have been in danger because I was throwing up since I'm pregnant. I sat there in shock for a moment, trying to take it all in. In just a day, my feelings had changed from worry to panic, thinking my life was falling apart again because I thought Amy might be unfaithful. Then I became concerned about someone trying to harm her. Now, I was learning that my wife was expecting a baby. I must have taken too long to respond. "Robbie, did you hear me? You're going to be a father," she said, looking at me with concern. "I'm going to be a dad?" I whispered, looking at my wife. She frowned at me. "Robbie?" "Oh no, Robbie." Amy looked worried. "There is no way that this... Robbie." She reached for me, tears forming in her eyes, thinking about what must have crossed my mind. I wrapped my arms around her. "Shh," I said. "I know, my love, and I am sorry that I doubted you. It's not fair to you." She cried for a moment, then tapped my chest lightly. "No, it's not fair, and I wish Georgia forever for what she did to you." She paused, looking up at me. "But I want you to know without a doubt, there has never been anyone else for me but you. This baby is yours." That night, we fell asleep in each other's arms, expressing our love for one another. I kept rubbing her belly, and we drifted off, feeling emotionally drained. In the morning, we shared intimate moments, then called her parents to let them know Amy was home and safe. We also called George, sharing a shorter version of what happened. By the end of the day, he had started legal actions against the production house and Kurt, sending 3 of his team members to New Zealand to handle things. "No more last-minute trips without me, okay, honey?" I said as we sat down for dinner that night. "I'm not going to be traveling at all from now on," she said, holding her belly and smiling at me. "Soon, I'll be as big as a barn." "And a very beautiful barn you will be," I replied, receiving a playful punch in the arm. In the months that followed, we were busy. The production house quickly fired Kurt, offering Amy and Al Rowe very good terms to settle things outside of court. Kurt was released on bail, but had to wear one of those electronic tracking devices. A few months later, we heard that he had been attacked, but the person responsible was never caught. As time went on, Amy's belly got bigger, and I enjoyed gently rubbing it every evening. Amy was busy with her job at Alro, but as her due date approached, I asked her managers to take on more of her work. Everyone who worked with her, including clients around the world, knew she wouldn't be traveling for a while. So they planned to come visit her in Australia over the next year, or to meet over video calls if needed. Alro Homes was also growing. With support from Alro, we added 2 more teams. It felt good to compete with my old job at Total Build and win 3 out of 4 projects against them. It made me feel like I was capable, and all the negative feelings my family had given me didn't matter. With so many changes happening, Amy asked Rain and Peter to sign privacy agreements a few months before our baby arrived. They were shocked to learn that their daughter was now very wealthy. They promised to keep this secret, including the news of Amy's pregnancy, from Georgia and my family. One warm August morning, as winter turned to spring, Amy went into labor. After a long 19 hours, my wonderful wife gave me a son. William Other was born, and I felt a pride I had never known. Amy was tired but happy to be a mother, and I couldn't have been prouder of her. In the weeks that followed, we got used to being parents, though sleeping was a challenge with our newborn. Darren and Tony became William's godparents. Then, unexpectedly, they moved to the Sunshine Coast to be closer to us. They surprised us again by announcing their engagement. The weekend they moved, we hosted a barbecue with Amy's parents while she lovingly cared for William. It felt comforting to have some normalcy, and I smiled a lot that afternoon, surrounded by family and friends. About 3 months later, while I was at the office, Cameron, one of our two salespeople, came in to see me. "Hey, boss, what's up?" he asked as he sat down in the chair across from my desk. I took a sip of coffee, fighting off sleepiness from being up late. I looked over at Cameron, who laughed when he saw my expression. "Don't worry, it gets better," he said, noticing the signs of a new father. "Does it?" I replied, hoping for some good news. The past week, I had been up with William until 3 in the morning, giving Amy the chance to rest. She was tired from feeding our son and trying to keep up with work at Alro. I helped out when I could. I didn't mind changing diapers, but Amy was the main caregiver for our baby, and no one else stepped in. So, whenever I could, I let her get some sleep. "Not really," he chuckled, "but don't regret a single moment of it, boss. You'll remember both the good and the bad as they grow and learn to find humor in it all," he said with a smile. Cameron had 3 children with his high school love. "What can I do for you today, Cam?" I asked, shifting the conversation and taking another sip of coffee, feeling the warmth wake me up. "I have an interesting situation, boss. You know how we've had some success in camping products with those modern container designs?" "Yes. We've been doing quite well." "Is there a new client?" I replied, hoping for a good update. Cameron shook his head. "No. One of the salespeople from a company we've been beating reached out to me yesterday." I raised my eyebrows. I understood his expression, but he didn't realize it. "Go on," I encouraged. "Well, he called me like he was better than everyone else," Cameron said, sounding annoyed as he remembered the conversation. "He was trying to sell me on how their product is far superior, but he wanted to team up because we've been winning against them so often." I laughed, not needing to guess who it was. But I let Cameron continue. "Honestly, Robbie, the guy was quite a character. Still, I remembered what you always say about finding an opportunity in every situation. So, I invited him to meet you for coffee in 2 weeks to chat. I doubt anything will come of it, but who knows? Maybe they could help sell our products." Cameron chuckled while I frowned. He looked at me, noticing my hesitation. I stood up, walked around the room, and then turned back to him. "Cancel the meeting, I'm not interested," I told him. "Boss?" Cameron looked surprised. "Just to confirm, you're talking about Brad Other Jr. from Total Build, right?" I asked. "Yeah. How did you wait? It's them, isn't it?" He caught on. I nodded. I hadn't shared my background, but the industry was small enough that rumors spread. Plus, the last name Other was hard to hide, so Cameron quickly connected the dots. "Consider the meeting canceled. I'll call and cancel it now," Cameron said, getting up from his chair. "Thanks, Cam." I sighed in relief. He paused at the door. "Sorry if I brought up anything uncomfortable. I should have realized." I waved it off. "It's okay. Keep looking for new chances. I appreciate your creativity, but I won't work with that company or my brother again." We chatted for a little longer before Cameron left. He returned about half an hour later to confirm he had canceled the meeting without mentioning my name. He noticed that Brad was unhappy and tried hard to get a meeting, even saying he would bring my father, the CEO of Total Build. Cameron kindly said no. I thought that would be the end of it. But when it comes to my family, I should have known better. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning, Amy and I walked into Alro Homes carrying coffee. I was holding a smiling little boy named William when my past came back to me. Now I understand why I couldn't get a meeting. "That guy works here," I heard my older brother say in a rude tone. We turned back to the waiting area and saw a group sitting on the couches. My father, Brad Jr., and Georgia were there. Georgia had a baby in a stroller and a young child on her lap. She looked at us, starting with Amy, then William, and finally me. When our eyes met, I saw a moment of sadness on her face as she noticed me with my son. My older brother, Brad, only glared at me after his comment. "I see your professionalism hasn't improved," I replied. "You're still a big disappointment, but yes, you're right. I am the reason you couldn't have your meeting." Brad opened his mouth to respond, but my father raised his hand to stop him. "Robert, when Brad canceled the meeting, we thought we would still come to meet Cameron and your boss. Alro Homes has taken more of our market share recently, and we hope to partner with you," he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Now that I'm seeing you, I have to ask, are you really trying to hurt our already struggling business?" Even though I don't appreciate my father's past actions toward me, I had to admire his attempt to be professional. I could see how he was reassessing the meeting he thought he could get. He had tried to re-engage with people since I made my move. I sighed. "No. Despite everything you've done to me, I have not looked for ways to take work away from Total Build. After winning most of the bids, I was surprised to find we were even competing with you." "But you're still taking work from us," shouted Brad Jr. I found it funny. William looked up at me and smiled when he heard my laughter. Without saying a word, I handed William to Amy, who was watching. I leaned in, kissed her, and quietly asked if she would take William into the office to avoid this situation. She kissed me back, smiled, then glanced at her sister, looking happier as she walked away with our son. As she walked by the reception desk, she gave the receptionist a look. The receptionist followed Amy, leaving me with my family and ex-wife. "What do you want?" I asked my father, crossing my arms. He studied my face, and his attitude changed now that we were alone. "I want to talk to your boss, the owner of Alro Homes. I need to tell him that my dishonest son is taking our clients. I will tell him you are a disgrace to the business and should have nothing to do with us. If he fires you and works with us instead, we can make a lot more money together. I will show him that you are not important, and I will make sure you, along with your wife and son, end up struggling, just like I said I would." I raised my eyebrows and smirked, wondering if he was losing his mind as he got older and things didn't go his way. He took a breath and continued. "You think you're in a good position, but you're not. I have years of experience. While you think your business is doing well, when I talk to your boss, I will show him that my experience and my team can outperform anything you offer." My father smiled like someone who was just holding on to reality. "When I speak with them, they will see that everything you learned came from me. I can do it better and faster. I will make sure you lose everything, and Alro Homes will let you go. You will be begging for help from me again." His words were filled with passion that felt almost desperate. His hatred for me clouded his better judgment. "So," I asked, "if that's your plan, why do you think he'll let you talk to the owner of Alro Homes?" I took a smug sip of my coffee. "You have no choice," my father replied, smiling again. "Now that I know you work here, I will start a campaign against you and make sure everyone understands who you really are." I laughed at him. "So let me get this right. You're willing to lie and cause trouble just to hurt me? Do you hate me that much because I wouldn't agree to what you wanted? By the way, is that my niece in the stroller? Or does it belong to Chris?" I smirked. No one said anything, which told me it wasn't a family connection. "It doesn't matter," my father snapped. "Brad is raising Colleen, which is what you should have done." I looked at them all and felt a tiny bit of sympathy for my older brother for the first time. He had been surprised to find out that he was raising another man's child. Brad Jr. and Georgia looked uncomfortable as they watched the conversation between my father and me. I chuckled, but quickly raised my hand when the three of them looked upset. Sorry, but I find this situation rather amusing. For that reason, I'll let you talk to both owners for a few minutes, I told my father. I don't think you will convince them with your obvious falsehoods, but it should be entertaining. Just give me a moment to set it up. I think they were not expecting that. Without saying anything else, I walked into the back office while they sat down, whispering to each other. They probably thought I would not agree to what they wanted. Inside the office, Amy was sitting in a chair, feeding William and chatting with Jenny, our receptionist. I told everyone to enter through the warehouse this morning since. Jenny glanced at Amy and then back at me, hesitating. Since your family is in the reception area. It's all good, Jenny, I replied, smiling at my wife. I've decided to let them spend a few minutes with the owners of Alro Homes. I told them they could explain why I should be fired for being incompetent, and why Alro Homes should partner with Total Build because of their experience. Amy looked at me curiously for a moment, then grinned. You're enjoying this, aren't you? She asked. Absolutely, I smiled back. Robbie, you know if we do this, your family and even Georgia might figure out what's really going on, she said with a frown. I sighed. Yeah. Brad probably wouldn't catch on, but Dad might. Are you worried about the secret being revealed? Amy paused to think for a moment. She adjusted her shawl, gently burping William. She shook her head. Now that we are married and have William, it's different, but even if your father makes the connection to Alro, he might just assume I worked there and used my connections to help us. Maybe, I said. Anyway, how about we get Cameron? He can introduce us. Great idea. My wife grinned. Just a few minutes later, Cameron came out, greeting my father, my brother, and Georgia. Moments later, Amy and I walked out holding hands, and the three of them looked surprised. Everyone, Cameron announced, I would like to introduce you to the owners of Alro Homes, Robbie and Amy Other. They are some of the best company owners I have ever met and incredibly sharp. Wow, Brad said, looking at the room with new eyes. You own this place? How's that possible? It must be worth millions. Amy replied in a professional tone. This facility is valued at about $2.5 million. Our other place is worth just over $3 million. In the last year, in our first year of business, Alro Homes made a little over $15 million with an 8% profit margin. Our product is becoming well known for its high quality in the market. Thanks to our CEO, we always meet our deadlines, and our investors are pleased with the growth at Alro Homes. Investors? Brad Jr. asked. Yes, investors, I answered. Alro Homes has outside investments, and our investment team was eager to help us get started as soon as we had our business plan ready. Even now, they help us with our development, creating connections and providing important advice. Right now, we are looking to expand a lot in the next few years. This includes new products, new markets, and a way of presenting our product as the best anywhere in the world, even better than what Total Build can make. My brother just stared at me. Georgia was busy trying to keep her son occupied while my dad frowned. You think you're clever? Because you own this place? My father suddenly said. Do you think you're better than us? He'll make sure to bring you down. Do you really think we would let this go? I'm going to ruin you. Dad, I said, using his title for the first time in years. He had almost forgotten I used to say that. For years you have ranted and said I should just obey you. You've threatened me over and over that you'd ruin me while wasting your time and energy. He started to reply, but I cut him off, tired of the argument. Enough already, I snapped, catching everyone's attention. Have I taken Total Build's market share? Absolutely, and your threats mean nothing. Every time you threaten me, I come back stronger. But I don't need to explain myself to you because you won't see my moves coming. You once told me I should have accepted what happened with one of the worst people, I said, glaring at my older brother. He didn't seem to understand. He was probably still trying to grasp that I am now a CEO. I turned back to my father, our eyes locked as I continued to speak firmly. You insisted that I accept someone who betrayed me while she was married to me. She not only became pregnant with my brother's child, but also had a child from another party. Can you just pause your dislike for me for a moment? Please try looking at things from a different perspective. Take a step back and see how you all appear from the outside. It looks like a big, tangled mess of connections. And while you pretend to be upset by my actions, your business has dropped to less than 20% of what it used to be. You've had to move 3 times in 2 years just to keep running. Good builders on the Gold Coast won't work with you because they can't trust when they will be paid. I also know you're on your last warning to keep your account in good standing, or you'll lose access to those supplies. My father looked shocked. Yes, Dad, I said, stressing the word. I've been paying attention to Total Build since I left. I worked hard there, and despite my feelings toward you, I'm sad to see how far things have fallen. Shut up, my brother yelled. We would have been fine if you hadn't taken our projects. I chuckled. Brad, maybe you need to look in a mirror. I shook my head. My brother was raising another man's child as his own. Yet, he called me out when I had walked away from a similar situation with the same woman. I glanced at Georgia, who was trying to avoid eye contact while caring for her son and rocking her daughter gently in the pram. I felt it was time to show them I knew more than they realized. But even before we launched Alro Homes, your market share had already dropped by over 13%. I'd guess that the deals you have now are more about Dad's experience than your selling skills. How many of your deals did I fix before I left? We all shared a few awkward moments of silence. Dad started to regain some of his confidence. Listen, Robert, I need you to back off. Leave our business alone. I thought we might work together. But knowing you own this place, I cannot partner with such a disappointment. Now it's personal. You're my biggest rival. I'll make sure your business fails, and you end up without a home, and your children will blame you for it. I shook my head. He was still not seeing things clearly. He stood up to leave, but wanted to say one last thing. You could have avoided all of this, Robert. You could have been happy. You could have been with Georgia and had a family by now, but instead, I'm going to make you suffer. He clearly didn't notice Amy and me walking in happily with William. I guess, I started, but Amy raised her hand. Listen, Brad, my wife said, speaking up for the first time. You just threatened us again. You have promised many times, but look around you. You see what Alro Homes has become. You must understand our strength. We are 3 times bigger than Total Build was at its best. And that was when my husband worked for you, making your life easier with his hard work. You really need to think clearly. This is the second time I have heard you threaten us. You are already breaking a restraining order. Also, just so you know, our security cameras have recorded everything we talked about, and we will send it to our lawyer. I think you know George. My father paused for a second, recalling his last encounter with George. He did not do well. The court dismissed the case before he could even provide his side. Amy continued, her tone strong like a CEO. If we get even one threat, if Alro Homes feels unsafe or gets any negative news from somewhere, our investigators are very good. If we find that total build or you are involved, we will respond. You will regret it before you can even think twice. Don't challenge us, Brad. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on our son and remind him how much we love him. She turned and kissed me. See you inside, dear. Cameron, let's let Robbie handle the trash today. With that, Amy walked back into the office with Cameron, leaving me with my family and ex-wife. The expressions on their faces were priceless. They looked like they were in shock. Well, you heard her, I said with a smile. Time for you to go. I was ready for anything. My father had a wild look in his eyes, and although my older brother was not the brightest, he also had a strange look. Dad looked at me for a moment, snorted, then turned and walked out without saying anything. Brad Jr. tried to mimic Dad, but then turned and walked away from me instead. I couldn't help but smirk, realizing even some people can learn. Georgia passed by Brad Jr. and they walked out without speaking, leaving just Georgia and me. Georgia gently rocked her baby in the stroller for a moment. Then she began to pick up toys from the floor. I stood with my arms crossed. At one point, she picked up a book and looked at me, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, Robbie, she said softly. Sorry, Georgia? What are you sorry about? I asked. I wasn't really angry. Time had softened that feeling about her. She looked at the security camera in the corner, and then shrugged. If it weren't for me, you'd still be a family. No one will say it, but they all blame me and treat me like an outcast when we're not in public. I doubt your parents would even speak to me if I didn't have the kids. She took out a tissue and wiped her eyes. Look at the way they just walked out on me. A lot of their anger is directed at me as much as they direct their words at you. Your father treats me badly. Your brother hardly pays attention to me. Your sister is almost always rude to me. Honestly, they don't get along that well. The only thing keeping them together is your mother. She is hurting and misses you a lot. She also holds me responsible for my past choices. She looked up at me with a faint smile. Yes, Robbie. I can admit my mistakes. I made poor choices and I regret them. I had a child that isn't yours. That alone feels like my stain on our past. And then I made another mistake with your sister's fiancé. It didn't help that I got pregnant. That's all she needs to blame me. At that moment, I realized Georgia was deeply troubled. She looked into my eyes, sadness clear on her face. And look at you, she said, trying to change the subject. You're doing well in your business, better than your family's company ever was. You also married a wonderful woman, she added quietly. She paused, noticing I was ready to react. Yes, Robbie, I know Amy. She liked you from the start. It doesn't surprise me you married her. I understand that after I let you go. Tears were now rolling down her cheeks, but I just stood there, not reaching out for her. And you have your son now, Georgia said. I know I denied you that. But if it helps, seeing him with you this morning felt like a dagger in my chest. I know I should have shared that moment with you. But I was too wrapped up in my own issues. She sniffed, picking up the diaper bag and hanging it on the stroller. Robbie, I'm not happy. The only reason I haven't taken more serious steps is because of my children, she said, giving me a small smile. I feel miserable, except for them, and live in a sort of nightmare where everyone treats me poorly. If that gives you some satisfaction, then you can have it as a form of apology for what we've put you through. Georgia, I began, touched by her apparent regret. No, Robbie, she interrupted, raising her hand. I don't want your pity. I just need you to know. Your family is incomplete without you. I am nothing without you. She finished quietly. Don't let your father get away with anything. Even with Amy's warning, I worry that their anger towards you will blind them to the truth. She began to push the stroller towards the door and paused as the door slid open for her, glancing back at me. Robbie Other, you are the kindest man I know. You are smart, hardworking, and honest. My sister is so lucky to have you. She looked me in the eyes. Treat her well, Robbie. She may not always show it, but I care for her just like I still care for you. Then Georgia walked out of my life again. I must have stood there for a while before I felt Amy wrap her arms around me. She's right. I am the luckiest woman in the world. I turned and kissed my wife. And I am the luckiest man. In the following months, we heard some rumors about our business, and soon Total Build was trying to win every project we were working on. George quickly shut down the gossip because we knew its source. In response to Total Build's actions, I made sure that Alro Homes seriously considered every project that could compete with them. If there was a good opportunity, we went for it. Otherwise, we let them have whatever was left. We also had our first trip overseas since the New Zealand event and William's birth. He was mostly weaned, and I could give him the milk from the supply Amy provided. The night before she left, Amy and I spent a lovely evening together, falling asleep happily in each other's arms. William and I saw Amy off at the airport, and I made sure that her security was ready while she traveled. I felt nervous those first few days, and I think Amy did too. But when she returned 10 days later, we both felt a sense of relief. Amy shared that she became anxious whenever someone approached her while dining, but she was comforted by having security around. We often enjoyed quiet moments together, and I cherished the closeness we shared. One night we were filled with joy when we found out in early May that we would be parents again. We were thrilled, but Amy experienced a wave of different emotions during this time. One evening, she accompanied Darren, Tony, and me to one of my non-professional fights. After the match, she was very upset over an illegal move by my opponent and had strong words for him. Then she turned to me, reminding me to take better care of myself. Later, after Tony had calmed down, she was very sorry for what had happened. Later that night, while we were in bed, she tried to make it up to me in her own way. A little after 6 months into her pregnancy, Darren and I went to a training camp for a fight I was getting ready for in June. It was a professional match, and both Darren and Tony, along with Amy, encouraged me to participate. Amy wanted to make amends for her earlier emotional reaction during my last fight. I kissed Amy as I left the house with Darren for our drive to northern New South Wales, which took about 6 hours. Tony and Amy planned to spend time together since they were both expecting. Yes, Darren and Tony were having a baby. They hadn't shared the news until after the first trimester, but with Tony feeling time was passing quickly for her, they decided to start trying. They were fortunate to conceive naturally despite some health issues Tony faced in her late teens. Darren was thrilled, and like my own wife, Tony's emotions were all over the place. We cared deeply for our partners, but a few days of training was exactly what we both needed. When we arrived at the camp, we joined a group of 12 for an intense 2-day training session. They had us working hard from early morning until late at night, with exercises that were tough for anyone who wasn't already fit. After the camp, we were worn out, but happy. I looked forward to a relaxing evening with our partners, maybe having a drink, cuddling, and enjoying some quiet time with my wife. But things turned out very differently. "Ladies, we're home," I announced cheerfully as Darren and I walked through the door. "You lied to me. What do you think you're doing here? Just leave," my wife shouted at me. "Amy, wait, what?" I tried to ask, but was interrupted. "Don't you wait me? How could you do this to me?" she cried, her voice mixed with anger and tears. Tony stood behind her, arms crossed over her pregnant belly. I was stunned. In all the time we'd been together, Amy had never spoken to me like that. We'd had arguments, but we always worked things out. "Amy, I don't understand what's going on," I said. "Robbie, how could you betray us?" "I thought I knew you," Tony said, her voice cold and filled with anger. "Tony, Amy, what are you talking about? What did I do?" I asked, glancing at Darren, but he looked just as confused as I was. "You were unfaithful while I wasn't there. That's what you did?" Amy said, her voice now filled with sadness. "I did what? Who?" I was bewildered. Something was definitely wrong here. "Tony, can you explain this? What's going on?" Darren asked. "Robbie and I were at the camp for the last 2 days, and it was all guys there. There was no funny business at all." "Darren, don't involve yourself in this," Tony replied, her eyes focused intently on me. "If you helped Robbie in any way, the only love you'll get from now on is your hand." I was really upset. I was being blamed for something I didn't do by 2 people who should know me well. "Tony, Amy, tell me what's going on," I demanded. Tony seemed to come back to reality as her anger faded a bit. "You're not with Georgia?" she asked, her eyes full of doubt. "What?" I replied, surprised. "Why would I be with my ex-wife? You all know how much I can't stand her." "Then how do you explain this?" Tony said, while Amy continued to glare at me and wiped tears away. Tony got up and grabbed Amy's phone. Amy looked at me with shock as she unlocked it. Tony opened Amy's email and pulled up a message from someone called a concerned observer. The email read, "To Amy, Other. I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband, Robert Other, is involved with your sister and his ex-wife, Georgia. This has been going on since their visit months ago. I know this might be hard to believe, but they have been meeting often. Please see the attached proof. Yours. Sincerely, a concerned citizen." Attached to the email were several pictures and a couple of videos. They showed Georgia inappropriately and some images that suggested I was involved with her. One short video even displayed me with Georgia. The last picture portrayed us smiling together. "Amy, I began. "It's not what it looks like, right, dear husband?" Amy snapped. "Look, Amy, I can explain," I tried to explain. But Amy, in her upset state, wasn't listening. She only heard the usual excuses for cheaters, ignoring the truth. "Is that you in those pictures?" she asked through gritted teeth. "Yes, but," I started again. "Get out," she yelled. "Get out!" She broke down in tears. "Amy," I called as she sank to the floor. "How could you do this, Robbie, after everything? How could you hurt Amy?" Tony said as Amy continued to cry. "Tony, it's not what it looks like," I insisted, glancing at Darren. He was caught between the email and trying to support me. "It's really not." I felt awful, sounding like a cheater even though I wasn't. "Just go. Leave, Robbie," Amy sobbed. My world felt like it was crumbling again. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.